So you've already known this. This is the Campus Alliance for Sustainability and the Environment. I am Laura Landolt from the Political Science Department. I am on sabbatical, so forgive me for being super casual and having mindless banter with my family while this is going on. Let me identify and announce our panelists. First up will be Jeff Insko, who is OU Professor of English and teaches in the Environmental Humanities. Sarah Griffith is an OU alumna with a BA in film who is now working as videographer for the OU Communications and Marketing. Annie Sullivan is OU Assistant Professor of Film Studies. And Alan Epstein is our very special instructor in political science, who, as he says, teaches a range of courses, each touching upon matters of democracy and how to get closer to it. We've already mentioned that Alan Epstein will be coming in a little bit late because he's teaching for another 10 minutes. But without further ado, let us hear from our very own Jeff Insko. Are you ready, Jeff? Is he frozen?
Thanks. Sorry, I think I just got cut off.
Uh-oh.
Second. But hopefully my connection is okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Yeah, can you hear me? Am I frozen?
Jeff, you're frozen.
Am I still frozen?
You are frozen. Maybe we should go to our third.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
You want to sign off and sign back on? Maybe that'll help. And in the meantime, we'll go to Annie Sullivan, if that's okay with Annie Sullivan. I'd hate to stick it to Sarah Griffith since this is her first panel.
Okay, well, I guess I will kick it off. I don't totally know what everyone else thought about the film yet, but I'm very excited to find out. And I'm going to try to not talk too much because I want to hear what everyone else has to say. One thing I can tell you about myself is that I'm a film studies assistant professor, but a lot of my work, my research work, oh, Jeff, you're back. Do you want to try to go first? Or do you want me to just keep talking?
Am I okay? It's entirely up to you. I apologize to everyone.
You go. I want to hear what you have to say.
Oh, geez. Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. This is the world we live in now, isn't it? We're all subject to the whims of the techno gods. Okay. Hi. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I'm delighted to be in conversation with all these smart people and with the rest of you. Okay. So I just some brief remarks. Maybe even a little disjointed, but we meant to keep it casual. But so I'll just start here. For my money, the funniest line in the movie, Don't Look Up, comes about halfway in, and it's not delivered by any of the film's big name stars. Having sparked a riling to the bar full of patrons, the government / Bash cellular scheme to mine the comet for rare minerals, which she says, will only make a bunch of rich people even more disgustingly rich. Jennifer Lawrence's Kate DiBiase then agrees to sign a legal document agreeing to suspend any further public statements on the matter. And so there's this scene where she's kind of exhausted and demoralized, and she returns home to her parents' house, sort of tail between her legs. But instead of the warm homecoming scene we might expect, or she certainly expects, her mother and father greet her coldly behind a locked door. And when Kate asks why, her mother says, "Your dad and I are for the jobs the comet will provide." And then the most terrifying line in the movie comes about 30 minutes later, after the drones that get deployed by the techno messiah figure, Peter Isherwell, who's played with creepy perfection by Mark Rylance, to break up the comet into manageable chunks, starts to fail. The drones are crashing into each other and blowing up. Isherwell says, "Well, the engineers assured me," and I admit that line gave me shudders. And so I'll explain why. Like, there's a lot I like about the movie and its handling of the climate crisis. A lot. But there's also a lot that it fails to do or say or address, and I'm sure we're going to talk about some of that. But in my remarks, I want to address the one thing that I thought was most interesting about the movie, and that's the narrative of extraction that is at the literal center of the movie. Because I think it's the closest the movie comes to addressing the causes of the crisis that it means to allegorize through the comet. But the problem with the comet, as lots of commentators have said this, is that it isn't a very effective vehicle for allegory, since its origin is celestial rather than anthropogenic. Like, humans didn't cause the comet, but humans, that is some humans, are definitely the cause of global warming. But halfway through the movie, and again, this is like almost exactly halfway through the movie, the story takes this interesting extractivist turn. The government's theatrical plan to obliterate the comet is interrupted by Isherwell because he's discovered that the comet contains rare minerals, and he calls them treasures from heaven that can be harvested for energy to power cell phones and improve lives. And he sort of rhapsodizes about all of the amazing things that these treasures will provide. And it's these treasures that Kate's parents refer to when they say they're in favor of the jobs the comet will provide. And relatedly, what gives Isherwell, the president, and ordinary people like Kate's parents confidence in the scheme to mine the comet for those treasures and provide those jobs is the assurance of the engineers. That is, the faith that technological ingenuity is going to solve the problem, what environmental humanist scholars and others call techno-utopianism. And I think it's here where the movie's at its most perceptive in diagnosing the climate crisis and identifying the bind that we find ourselves in, which isn't just a matter of the things the movie foregrounds, political opportunism and buffoonery and social media distractions and all the rest. Rather, the movie at these moments seems to recognize, even if it doesn't really emphasize, the perversity of doubling down on the practices that have caused the crisis as somehow also being the solution to the crisis. That is, extractivism, the thing that got us here, is also imagined by Isherwell and
I think Isherwell must have discovered what Jeff was saying and intervened.
Yeah, Jeff froze as you were analyzing the Isherwell moment.
Am I still frozen?
No, not now.
Damn it, I'm sorry, you guys. Yeah, the movie seems to recognize, even if it doesn't emphasize, the perversity of doubling down on the practices that have caused the crisis as also being the solution to the crisis. Like extractivism, the thing that got us here, is also imagined by Isherwell as the thing that will get us out of this mess. And I just want to say a quick word about what I mean by extractivism, because I mean here both a material practice and the underlying logic of extraction, this instrumentalizing logic that's predicated on what Naomi Klein calls, quote, the reduction of life into objects for the use of others. So here extraction is coterminous with abstraction, which is to say that just like geophysical extraction literally removes minerals, metals, elements, and sometimes humans from the geological strata or geographical locations in which they're embedded, so does extractivism remove them conceptually from what the political ecologist Jason Moore calls the web of life, the interconnected geological histories and the social and ecological networks in which they're embedded. And in doing so, it transforms these things into fungible commodities, converting nature into natural resources, converting human beings into human capital stock, a phrase that we've encountered recently, by severing them from the interrelationships that might otherwise be understood to define them. And it does all this in the name of growth and productivity and commodity accumulation. And I also just want to point out then that this is also the logic of colonialism, the exploitative legacy of which is constantly visible to us. So I have struck, just like this last week, for example, an oil pipeline ruptured in Ecuador and it sprayed crude oil into the air and coated flora and fauna in the Amazon rainforest. This is again just this week. In India, an abandoned coal mine collapsed and killed 5 people who were digging illegally for coal. And you may have seen back in December that a European space satellite captured the image of a massive plume of methane gas that was released into the air during routine maintenance on a pipeline owned and operated by the Williams Company in Georgia with the chilling name of Transcontinental. So, like, you know, the movie is only secondarily, I think, interested in these things, but I'm struck by the way at the end of the film, it actually gestures toward these histories of colonialism, when the escape hatch for President Orlean and for Isherwell is to hop on a spaceship and go to another planet, colonizers once again. And there's a great shot as the people are emerging from their pods in that spaceship where we get a glimpse of who some of those individuals are. And one of them is a representative from the fictional Texcon oil company. But the idea is colonizing another planet, and it's a little too close to home given, you know, Jeff Bezos and other billionaires' forays into space recently. And so the last thing I'll just say about this is that I don't think the movie has any answers to this state of affairs that it diagnoses at times. In fact, it mostly kind of retreats from those issues rather than addressing them head on. And it prefers to end with a scene of domestic intimacy, which I confess I found to be quite moving. And yet at the same time, the film, for all of its perceptiveness in other ways, seems to be completely unaware of how that same domestic intimacy is also reliant upon the histories of colonial extraction that it looks at otherwise. I mean, you know, one of the topics of conversation is the coffee that they drink, and without a whole lot of awareness of where that coffee comes from and what the processes that bring that coffee to our tables. So I think I'll just stop there, having sort of raised a bunch of kind of interesting facets of the film that I think are worth some attention. Thanks. And sorry about the tech problems.
And our next presenter is Sarah Griffith.
Hi, everyone. So what I found really interesting that I kind of wanted to raise as a topic today is just the technique of using comedy as a way to tackle this very serious issue. And I don't know if anybody else was here. I think it was maybe 2 years ago now when Mary Jameson had Morgan Heim come to campus, who's a conservation filmmaker. And she did some presentations on some of her work. And something that stuck out to me was that she did a film called Deer 139. And it was my first time kind of seeing a science documentary that had comedy at the root of it. And I thought that that was a really interesting way, because that wouldn't be the first subject that I would think would incorporate comedy into that. But personally for me, I always am wanting to learn about these subjects, but when it comes to the media that I like to consume, I do personally consume a lot of comedy and lighthearted shows and movies. So I think that when it comes to things that I want to create, using comedy as a way to tackle these serious subjects was something that I found really, really successful in this movie. Because I would say if this was just like a traditional documentary on climate change, or even just a movie that was more of a drama, I can't say for sure that this is something that I would have necessarily wanted to watch, which, you know, I know that's probably something that I should, but realistically, I'm not confident that I would have. So I thought that that was really interesting, the way that it kind of walked the line in tone of being, you know, comedy, something that would appeal to a lot of audiences, but also something, it had to still maintain that serious undertone in order for people to take it seriously, and especially for the ending to really hit the way that it did. And kind of bouncing off what Jeff said, about that ending. That's something I went back and I watched a few times, and I thought that that was really impactful, for the same reason he mentioned, that you are focusing on this emotional connection and how they're coping with dealing with the end of the world versus just some big destruction scenes, explosions, special effects. Of course, that was incorporated in there a little bit, but I think that the way they chose to showcase that scene, for at least me, made it very powerful and made me think, like, what would I be doing if it was the end of the world? Who would I be with? How would you deal with those emotions? Kind of like putting you in that seat. And the other thing I wanted to bring up as well was something that stood out to me was the way that they were kind of cross-cutting throughout the film, these really stylized, kind of beautiful nature scenes that were, you know, polar bears and close-ups on bees in rainforest. And there was even at one point in the film where it switches from one of those really beautiful shots and it cuts right to, you know, they're in the city and the garbage truck is slamming closed or something like that. So I thought that that juxtaposition was really nice. And especially at the end, the way that they're cutting all those back and forth from the explosion to the really beautiful shots to, I think they even had some photos in there, and back to the family. I really liked the way that that was incorporated from the editing perspective. And also when I went back to watch that final scene, I did notice something that made it really eerie to me was that they actually had some of, I don't know if anybody else noticed this, but they actually had some freeze frames at the end. So while, you know, the table is starting to shake and the lights are flickering, there's a few moments where the chaos is happening. And it kind of reminded me of like Fight Club, where they're like, you know, flashing a frame in there or something just kind of subtle, but they did a freeze frame. And it's almost like, you know, it's happened so quickly, you can tell something is off, but you don't know exactly what it is. And it really gives you this eerie feeling like maybe space and time is kind of getting messed up, or that the wave is coming. And just those two things on the editing end, I thought were really interesting techniques that they used, and that I really liked that, especially at the end, just to give it that ominous feeling. And then just a few other small points that I had while I was doing a little bit of research. I found that this was actually written prior to COVID, which I found very interesting, seeing as how it relates so much to the situation that we were going through. And that's what they kind of said too, like they were evolving the script to keep up with what was actually happening in real time, on seeing all the similarities. And almost, I did write down, they were having to make it more quote unquote ridiculous and more extravagant just to keep up with what our reality turned out to be after they wrote it. And really, oh, one other funny thing that I just appreciated about the comedy was the prayer to stuff that they mentioned. Apparently there was a lot of improv throughout the movie, and that was one point that I heard that was an improv, and that really stood out. And I think that that's really interesting that the director was able to leave a lot of the film open to improv and let the actors kind of develop that on their own. And then the last thing I was just going to mention is that I'm actually happy the world ended at the end of the film. I was really thinking like they better finish this off. Like, I don't want to see something go and destroy that comment, like the way they've been setting it up. So like in the end, obviously, like I'm, you know, I had all these emotions. I cry all the time, movies, shows and everything. So I'm crying, you know, like, but I was like, yes, it would have felt so wrong if they stopped the comment. I would have been like, wow, that just ruined it for me. So I was actually happy that they followed through with what they set up, and that it wasn't the, you know, typical, you know, tie it up in a bow Hollywood ending. So I would think that's pretty much all I have for finishing my comments. So I'll pass it back.
That's great, Sarah. Thank you. We have interesting, very different perspectives on this matter. And now we'll have, once again, Annie Sullivan, Assistant Professor of Film Studies. Annie started her presentation. in order to give Jeff a chance to come back, and now she will continue.
Yeah, I didn't really say much other than I'm a film studies professor. And so I'm really happy I got to hear you both go, because I'm going to build on things that you both said. Coming at this as a film professor, I had two things in mind. One is that I watch a lot of mass entertainment, and I think very carefully about the messaging of mass entertainment. And I teach my students to read allegory into films, dystopian disaster films. And so I also am the type of person that watches radical anti-colonial documentaries. So I will say that watching this film, there wasn't much new information it provided me in its allegory of climate crisis. But there were moments I felt some confirmation as an academic where it's like, yes, why aren't people looking up? I too want to know why you're being charged for the snacks as a former grad student. So there's these moments of recognition. And I remember going into this movie thinking very much like what Sarah was talking about, that any film that uses comedy to get people to look up has promise and can be a useful resource. So I wanted to, think about this as an opportunity. This got a lot of viewers on Netflix to watch it. However, I have some reservations, which I will now share, about the messaging of the film. So we get people to look up, but what do they see? Similar to Jeff, I felt that there were some inadequacies in the comet metaphor. The biggest one for me, though, was that the kind of plot is structured around these two suburban experts in Michigan. So props to our, the intellectual work of colleagues in the great state of Michigan that discovered this comet as happenstance. However, like Jeff brought up, climate change is not some sort of happenstance that we are encountering as, white Americans. It's something that has been created by the forces of colonialism, and it's something that has a global impact. And that messaging the comet doesn't get is that there have been people who've been actively protesting and commenting upon the catastrophe of climate crisis for generations. And most of those people are Black and Indigenous people of color, who we do not really see featured in this film. And one of the things I thought a lot about is in the editing, there's sometimes these that Sarah brought up, these beautiful insert shots of nature. But in those insert shots of nature is the only place we actually see the possibility of indigeneity existing. And they're presented, I took 2 screenshots and I put them in a slideshow. If someone hasn't seen the film and wants to just see what I'm talking about, there's these beautiful nature shots, and they sometimes feature like the only shots of a global humanity. And those people are always figured as passive victims of this apocalypse, rather than people who've been leading a fight against climate crisis for generations. So there seems to be this messaging that everything is created and problematized by the United States government, the president in particular, without thinking about the work that social actors are doing to challenge climate crisis. So what I see absent in this film is that, we look up, but we don't really see a solution. And we're not really pointing us to the people who've been trying to offer solutions for generations. So I think there's that level of erasure there. I mean, I do think this film does a really good job at mocking the dismissal of scientific expertise in ways that I found somewhat compelling, and it's sometimes humorous. It mirrors what we see on the screen, but there's also ways in which I don't know if the film can overcome its own its own positioning within this glamorized Hollywood industry, where, the film critiques the fact that Kate Dibiasky is sidelined for her male colleague who becomes the star of the media exposure. However, Jennifer Lawrence also got paid $5 million less than Leonardo DiCaprio to make this movie. So it's kind of calling attention to those inequities, yet replicating them. And these sorts of disaster movies also have pretty big carbon footprints. And I don't know what this film is doing to offset that. So we're paying Leonardo DiCaprio $30 million to raise awareness for climate change, while he's also spending his free time partying on a yacht with Jeff Bezos, which he did for New Year's Eve. I did some reading on the film. So there's this way in which I'm wondering if we're in the system, could they have done better to call attention to the problems of Hollywood and the problems of glamorous celebrities. I mean, I really liked the use of Ariana Grande singing a song called "We Should Have Listened to the Goddamn Qualified Scientists." And it seems, based on the Netflix exposure of this documentary, that we're more apt to listen to famous celebrities like Meryl Streep and Leonardo DiCaprio tell us about climate change than we are to actually listen to scientists making documentaries about climate change. But at the same time, once you have that level of exposure, I think there's a need to have better messaging. And I just felt there were times when there were no solutions offered and no attention to the work that's actively being done within the US and definitely beyond, to kind of fight against these systems of oppression that the film is kind of calling attention to. I want to have better images to see when we look up. So those are just some of my thoughts, and I'm excited to hear what others have to say. So I'm going to pause for now, I guess, and I can keep going. I have like 7 pages of notes.
Thank you so much. I have been texting Alan and he's not responding, which is unusual. Usually he gets back to me. So maybe he's hung up. Chances are he's discussing an important matter with a student. So because that's the kind of professor he is. So let's just let's go from here. And then if Alan pops in, he still has some time, then he can wait. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So he's not here yet. I see that Andrea has a question.
Just a follow-up question to Annie. How would a production company actually achieve a carbon offset? How would that actually happen?
I'm not going to act like I'm an expert in this. There are filmmakers that try to think very critically about their carbon offsets. So there's some that, however, I don't think this is a full solution, because it's basically like them trying to make some sort of reparations for what they've done. But there's ways that you can, what you figure out your carbon footprint of your production. You can reduce the amount of energy being used. You could also, there's some productions that plant trees for as much. They figure out their calculation for their carbon footprint and then plant trees to offset that. There's choices for sustainable filmmaking, but by and large, Hollywood does. I mean, it's not like the oil industry. It's not that extreme in terms of its carbon footprint, but there are choices they could make to lower the use of productions. And I don't think this wasn't as big as Mad Max or one of those films that was trying to make an environmental message. But if you've studied the history of something like Mad Max Fury Road, they also sort of ruined the Namibian desert where they were filming that movie, as a consequence of their choice to film there. So there are ways that big productions can devastate environments. And in some ways, it's very much like what we as citizens could do. They could recycle on set, they could reuse props, they could pick pre-existing locations rather than construct things and waste materials. Like if you ever watched a TV show and you see bags of garbage, they're made, they don't use real bags of garbage. They make fake bags of garbage that are then just replicating their own bags of garbage. They're just creating new bags of garbage to just have one shot of a bag of garbage. So there's this way in which there's a lot of waste that goes into it, but there's not a big solution to how to make Hollywood more sustainable, or at least I don't have the answers. Planting so many trees can only get us so far. But I would think that people who are making this movie, like Leonardo DiCaprio, really does care about the environment. He's made other documentaries, but he also took $30 million to do this. And I don't know where that $30 million is going. And so if it's going somewhere, I'd rather it go to environmental causes if they're getting us to look up. Oh, the other thing I wanted to just say really quick, since I have the microphone, is that final scene in the room where Leonardo DiCaprio's character, Dr. Mindy, says, when he's talking about he's grinding his own coffee beans, he goes, "We really did have everything, didn't we? Everything we needed, didn't we?" And then the world dies. I just kept thinking, well, you had everything you needed, but there's massive global inequity across the world, and climate crisis impacts people who aren't you, people who do not look like you more than anyone else. Like there's places where the impact of global crisis is way worse than suburban Michigan. So it just part of me kept thinking, but like, where are those other people? Because they're very much absented.
Can I interject a quick thing here on that point? Alan's here, and I want to hear from Alan. And Annie referenced it in passing, but whatever, 10 years ago, I think maybe, DiCaprio made a documentary on climate change called Before the Flood, which I think in lots of ways is really good. But the best scene in Before the Flood is when DiCaprio goes to talk with the Indian activist Sunita Narain, and she kind of rips him a new one in terms of talking about the massive extraction and combustion of coal that's happening in India. And a sort of Westerner flying across the country to sort of ask hard questions about India's increasing carbon footprint. And she points out that, getting to this question of inequities, that millions and millions and millions of people in India's primary source of energy is dung, and that the problem of extractivism is a problem that the West has produced, and that the West's habits of consumption need to be addressed before any sort of finger wagging about development in places that are former colonies begins. So it's an interesting, I think, kind of juxtaposition between this movie, like DiCaprio knows that stuff, like he learned that, and I think he sort of leaves that scene appropriately chastened, I think, and yet there isn't much of a glimpse of that in Don't Look Up. It seems not to have infiltrated the making of the comedy. I'll just stop there. Thanks.
I'm so happy that Alan has joined us. And Alan, since you weren't here before, I'm going to provide a completely inadequate synopsis of what your other speakers have mentioned and talked about. Jeff Ensko discussed extractivism and colonizing logic. Sarah Griffith was discussing insights into editing practices and decisions in the film that were very interesting. And Annie Sullivan has discussed some of the shortcomings of the movie in multiple dimensions, in particular, perhaps some of the hypocrisy and extractivism involved in making that very film. So without further ado, I turn this over to Alan Epstein.
Thank you, Laura. Welcome. Hello, everybody. Sorry I'm late. Class. What can I say about the film? So I'll approach it this way. I really like the film in a certain sense that to me, it captured a Trumpian moment in our very confused and bothersome present. I think it nicely talked about the corporate capture of the state in very disturbing ways. It obviously had a lot to say about our mass media, which is another dimension of corporate capitalism, in the sense that it lost all pretense of engaging in enlightenment and informing, and instead is essentially simply an instrument for capital accumulation by exploiting celebrity and scandal and promoting everything from amoral social relationships to narcissism, leaving essentially a kind of adult public which is incapable of critical judgment, or even more importantly, of inclusive citizen engagement, and depends upon seemingly ceaseless hits of mind-numbing pleasure. And I thought that captured a certain dimension of how I understand much of our mass media very well. But the film also bothered me in a very important sense, in that it seems to skewer every possible agent for change. The government is skewered because it's shackled to corporations, which are essentially too involved in profit making to be helpful. It skewers the cool rich, the term I love from the Jonah Hill character, who are too self-absorbed to be a part of the solution. It skewers what Peter Isherwell in the film, the character Peter Isherwell, called the lifestyle idealists, the liberal do-gooders who seem to be motivated by ethical concerns, but are quickly enamored of pleasure and turn away from pain like field mice. And they skewer scientists for being trembling and tranquilizing and sometimes unwilling to confront the public with bad news. And the everyman scientist, Dr. Mindy, of course, becomes co-opted by sex and power and becomes a problem rather than a solution to it. They skewer international cooperation in the sense that India, Russia, and China fail in their attempt to do something about the comet. They skewer technical solutions where they obviously fail to disintegrate the comet. And then they're sort of Richard Branson, Elon Musk, or Jeff Bezos alternative to find a Goldilocks planet becomes less a kind of Garden of Eden than a sort of malevolent paradise that where people become prey once again. We've kind of gone back to the beginning. I love that part. Religion is skewered in the sense that the scene about the Last Supper where Dr. Minnie's wife, June, acting like a Christ figure, forgiving everyone. And we see the born-again skateboarder evangelist Yule, who offers a prayer of acceptance, where to me, that is sort of like the ultimate logical next step of denial, which of course is what the film is seemingly all about, where we deny, we put ourselves in a corner. All we can do then is accept our fate. And of course, in this case, there's no planetary salvation for the prayer. Instead, we just have oblivion. So ultimately, to me, the solution is of course, people. It's of course, having an engaged citizenry who can be inclusive and engaged and resist. But that is also skewered in the film, where people are shown to be complete idiots, where they're incapable of engagement in the bar scene, where finally, Jennifer Lawrence's character discloses to the patrons what's really going on. They're not really trying to divert the comet. They're going to mine it for resources, and people explode. They can't take the news and they just mindlessly riot. And Dr. Mindy says, these people, we can't rely on them. We can't even use them for an online petition, let alone trying to picket or bring down the government. There's no agent out there for change. And this is really bothersome to me because, of course, we know that ultimately it's people who do everything. Everything that we have in the country that's worth having has come because of popular pressure, or they've pressured those in power to bend, at least temporarily, to do something fitting, even if it's temporary. And that seems to be absent from the film. So I agree that this is a film made by people who have a lot of privilege, who don't understand that there are people in real need today that need solutions. And I'm inclined to talk about how maybe the film raises a question didn't intend to really raise and certainly didn't answer, which is that if what they really want is for us to stop diverting our attention away, to confront, to be fact regarding, to address actual problems by talking about them, facing them, as Dr. Mindy says in the film, so we can fix ourselves, then I wonder if this is really the solution. Because you can talk as we do, you can be aware, as I think all of us are, and nothing necessarily gets done. There's a big logical step between being aware and actually engaging in resistance. And the film has no real positive message to talk about resistance. And what can happen is if you simply talk and, as some people call it, doom scroll, you can doom scroll and doom scroll and doom scroll and become more and more aware of problems, but not actually do anything about them, then ultimately what we end up with is acceptance, where we simply put ourselves in a corner and all we can do is just accept our crumbling fate. And I think the film unintentionally raises that question about how we need to move from simply awareness and talking to actually resisting. And that requires engaging with ordinary people to do that in all kinds of ways. And I think the film fails to do that, doesn't inspire me to do that. Maybe that's not the intention of the film. I don't blame it for that, but that's what I took from the film, that it left me empty and even more depressed than before. And I think that's where we don't need that anymore. We're already sufficiently depressed. We need to find ways to inspire people to resist. And resist is the word that I would emphasize that we need to do. And in case we don't do enough of that either, I think we focus on dialogue and raising awareness, on discourse, which is essential. But unless we resist, then we're just engaging in a luxury practice as well. We all need to find better ways to resist. And that is something which I think the film left me with, the need to do more than I'm already doing, which is not enough. So on that depressing note, I'll stop.
Okay, Kyle, did you have a question or comment? We can't hear Kyle, but we'll go to Bob. Is that how you're called? I heard Jeff call you Bob, but is it
Rob.
Robert?
Rob.
Okay. Rob. Okay.
So I thank you all, very smart presentations, all interesting and compelling and enlightening. I have a question about the very kind of allegorical premise of the film. In what sense, is there a sense in which the decision to have a comet stand in for the human caused climate catastrophe kind of produces the evasions and the failures of the film to address the subject in a direct way? Because you could conceivably watch the film and not really think about climate, right? It doesn't necessarily internally engage that question. So I'm just curious of what you would think about whether the choice of having a comet instead of an actual climate catastrophe be the subject of the film might actually cause some of the problems that you've been discussing so interestingly.
Okay, I'll say a quick thing. I mean, sometimes the more I think about the comment, I don't know that the writers of the movie are thoughtful enough to think of the comet this way. But in some ways, like the comet might very well be read as a pretty good metaphor for the Anthropocene, because the Anthropocene sort of identifies the problem as like the responsibility for the problem as everyone yet no one. And sort of like the comet kind of captures that in a way, but I'm not sure that was the way that the filmmakers were thinking. But this is maybe a question for Annie, who knows much more about the history of these films than anything. It seems to me like just a cinematic convention. They're just playing upon like the long history of disaster, movies in some way.
My take was that the comet also offers this level of immediacy and urgency, where it's like it gives them it has a setup. There's a deadline. The comet, based on our NASA calculations, will get here in 6 months. We have 6 months to do this. So, and then uses that as the platform to critique this glaring denial that we see. And in some ways, it felt more apt for COVID as a metaphor, because so much of the critique is structured around the dismissal of scientific expertise, the dismissal of peer review, the dismissal of experts saying, pay attention to this. So I think, and then the political mixed messaging based on that. And so some ways there is that emphasis, but I think what they did was try to think of an easy concept that it's hard to deny. When someone says you have 6 months, there's a comet coming, it's something inescapable. But in doing so, it kind of moves away from the reality of climate crisis, which is that it's been a slow motion catastrophe for a couple hundred years that's, been having a global impact. And so I think there is this way that it also is discovered by American scientists, which allows them to then sidestep a lot of the global discourse that we have about climate change and American inaction that they don't really deal with in the film, because it's a specifically American identified problem. And then everyone else gets kind of short shrift, is some of my read. And Sarah made a good point in the chat that the other part of the comment is that you can finally see it. It has a payoff.
Yeah, this is a really good point. Laura, I think your mic was off.
It was. Jim, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, a comment and it's confessional as much as anything else. Somebody who has been involved in trying to push back on water shutoffs and do little things that I can to resist, including nonviolent civil disobedience, but also complicit. Lily and I watch K-drama at night to get away from the doom and gloom, and we're perpetuating the problem when we do that. But in our conversation, one of the things I have as a question mark is how we talk about the non-human world in relationship to climate catastrophe. And the comment is coming from an Indigenous teacher that my wife and I regularly spend time with over the last 10 years, who cautions us continually to not perpetuate human supremacy when we talk about this kind of stuff. It's not actually us who will take out the planet. A hurricane's not a human being, neither is sea rise, neither is an earthquake. We're provoking it and triggering it, but it's actually wild nature, herself, itself, themselves, who is doing the changing and has done so, 5 previous great extinctions. We're not the end all and be all. We think we are, and that's part of the way we've gotten into the trouble we're in, because we think the entire planet is ours to take, re-engineer, and do with what we damn well please. And then we get hit with the blowback from the biosphere on what we have unleashed, and we still put ourselves in the driver's seat in, oh, we've got to change this. And I'm all for changing it. I mean, there's not just human life, there are human beings that are at risk, BIPOC communities. I live in inner city Detroit, my 35 years here. I've worked constantly with African-American folk, called in question as a white male continuously. So I'm not wanting to speak out of that kind of privilege, but I do want to ask, how do we not perpetuate our sense of our own supremacy and recognize that there is an element of agency that is beyond us? We're newcomers on the planet. And if we get wiped out, that's not at one level a big deal in terms of the natural world. The universe has been around for 13.8 billion years as best we know, and we don't know what it was before that. How do we, yes, galvanize urgency to do everything we can, and at the same time recognize we're not the end all and be all?
I'm certainly going to let the panelists answer, of course, after I interject my comments, but I wanted to highlight the fact that Sarah's comments, I agreed very much with Sarah when she mentioned the cutaway shots of the of nature in all its beauty, non-human nature. I think on the positive side, if we read that in a positive way, it was a sense of contrasting against this hyper simplistic, silly, completely artificial world, this much larger and more varied and magical world. So I agreed. I think Sarah touched on that in her discussion, and she's shaking her head yes. So I will let her make a comment if she wants.
Yeah, I had well, first I want to say about the comment that Jim had on the world ending, when I was just watching some more commentary on it, and I saw some comments being like, the film didn't end with the world ending, just the humans were gone and then the world's still there. So it's, world ending movie, but also, just the end of the humans, and the world will continue to exist. So I thought that was an interesting point with that. And then I did forget to mention this earlier, and kind of with what Annie was mentioning about, I did like the cutaways, but then at the same time, I felt that they were a bit in showing the nature as this untouched, pristine, glamorized way, that it's like, oh, it has to be one or the other, or it's to the extremes, which I also think can be a bit of a concerning way to show it, that it is good for the contrast, especially with the cities and that development. But that is just another side thing that I had on that, which I liked it in some ways, but then in other ways, I'm like, this isn't really like, I think it's, people think about it, oh, nice, beautiful, pristine, untouched nature. And I think some of our comments about this in case before in some of our discussions, especially even with like national parks and, oh, it's just something to be preserved and not touch. But really, when it goes back, there's people that are working and living with the land for years and years and years. And that is all part of the balance rather than something to just set aside. So I thought in that way, some of the shots were kind of like, oh, a little bit, I don't know exactly how to put into words, but I just from Laura bringing it up, I wanted to touch on that again. So.
Nice.
I guess just real quick. I mean, I think, you know, to Jim's important point, like I think like the film is symptomatic or emblematic in its, you know, epistemological shortcomings. I mean, you know, just it has trouble imagining. I don't think anywhere it imagines or even really acknowledges a relation between the human and non-human that isn't essentially extractivist at bottom. And, you know, like it gropes around maybe for like better ways of living within extractivist epistemologies, but like it, and to Annie's point, you know, about this, which is a little odd because it's not as if those otherwises are not available and have not been available for a very, very long time. The movie doesn't seem to see them.
Would anyone else like to comment on Jim's thread? I think Jim wants to comment on it. Jim.
I wanted to just say one thing I forgot. The same Indigenous teacher is constantly railing at us for being lazy and for preferring our screens to actually doing the work with our hands to learn how to live in place, rather than relying on this globalized industrial infrastructure, and to not simply think about resistance, but about making beauty locally in the way that many Indigenous communities have majored in before being caught up and engulfed in the maw of neoliberal globalization.
And speaking of resistance, I'd like to convey Marie's question. What did Alan specifically mean by resistance? Personally, I don't think it needs to be either or. I think it can be both and, but I'd like to hear from Alan.
I don't have a definitive answer. I don't think it's up to me to give a definitive answer. I think it's something we just don't talk enough about. And I'm very serious about this. We don't talk about this. I think it because it's threatening to talk about it. Just like Jim's mentioning about maybe finding better ways to live relationally with others on the planet, rather than living in ways in which we exploit and take and not give back. These are really fundamental questions that I think we do a very bad job of asking and discussing. We don't discuss them. And I think that's part of it. But it also means, of course, something on a more not elemental, but on a more risky level, where, you know, Jim talked about engaging in civil disobedience. And there's so many things that people can do, which may be off-putting. I don't know if I'm going to lose an audience here, but, you know, we know, for example, this is just something I picked up from Andreas Malm, right, who may not be the most welcome person in the room here, but he talked about an action they did in Stockholm where they recognized that SUVs were a very important source of carbon emissions, maybe a very major source globally, since they're all over the place and they do a lot of damage. But they simply went around, a gaggle of people, taking little pebbles or grains, and they identified SUVs where they were parked in Stockholm. They unscrewed the tire pressure caps from all the vehicles. They put this little pebble in all the top of the pressure caps and they screwed them back on. Over the course of the evening, all the tires went flat. People came out in the morning and they saw their SUVs were flat, and that reminded them that this was an unacceptable vehicle to have. It was a violence against property, against carbon emissions property, not against human beings, not against something else. But that was a kind of, not harmless, could cause a lot of inconvenience. People are angry, they call them terrorists. But it's something that raises awareness in terms of people not simply being passive and watching their world blow up around them. And I don't have, many solutions or suggestions, but I think these are things which people in a society like ours, where it's still possible to discourse, can talk about more than we have and come up with ways in which we can push back, ways which don't harm people, but harm what is emitting and causing our future to shrink before us. So I'm not really answering your questions because I don't have an answer. I'll be the first to admit I don't have an answer. We need to dialogue about this and stop pretending that any one person has an answer. And I hope that's not an evasive response, but that's how I feel.
I want to just build on that and answer the question that I think you really smartly raised about the environment being beyond just us as westernized humans. But I also think, when they have those images of indigenous people, which I referenced earlier, I said that they makes them seem like passive, like they're just part of the landscape. And it does perpetuate that trope you see in movies where indigenous people are just like one with nature, which is troubling. But I also think there have been people who've had ideas and suggestions, and there are environmental activists who've been on the front lines for generations that we could listen to, who might have ideas. And I think there are ways that collectively we could be putting pressure as a citizen, as a kind of public, on the choices we make as individuals, but also on the governments of multiple nations to make changes. So it's both a personal and professional. I think we're all guilty, at least I know I am, of being privileged, of having only so much mental bandwidth to fight. And so I also see that there's inevitability that we're destroying the earth will maybe survive in new ways. But I also can look out my window and see there's tremendous inequity as to who is getting hurt during this apocalypse. And the system we have in place does not need to be this way. This like neo-colonial capitalist system, we could change it, that we could make political choices, radical solutions that could change it. And we could also think collaboratively, who's getting hurt by this? Haiti. Haiti's really not the only country, but as an example, Haiti's getting hit by hurricane, earthquake, and they have so fewer resources than the global capital that's like located in the United States. There's ways we can think about sharing resources, not like fossil fuel resources, but collective efforts to think humanistically across borders in ways that might not stop climate change as an inevitable process, but at least help improve the quality of people's lives right now that we're just not doing. So I think there's things we could be doing more of. And I'm definitely part of the problem in that I always think of things I could do more of, but it's hard.
I've been inserting myself into this conversation, and I encourage any of you to just jump in whenever you like. Who else would like to respond to this discussion?
Vanessa has recommended Hospicing Modernity by Vanessa Oliveira. I have it on my bedside actually, but have been diverted into reading The Dawn of Everything. I know that there are a lot among folks working with Indigenous people who are trying to become death doulas. How do you accompany people into the understanding that we're not going to get out of this world alive, whether you like it or not. And this professor emeritus, Guy McPherson, who has been very forthright in asking us to face into what's really coming down, would often say, well, how would you want to spend your life, right? What would be meaningful to you, knowing that you're gonna die? And I think it's very hard to move away from a triumphalist, especially in this country, from a triumphalist vision of we can solve this, right? I don't think it's an encouragement to be a defeatist either, but it is just cultivating a tragic vision that asks the question, well, given the fact that you're going to die, how would you want to live in such a way that can feed life for those who are coming after? And so that's where my thoughts were going. Even as I watched the movie, I said, well, what can compel people who are so distracted, entertained to death, right? What is it that can compel them to turn toward a different way? And I think it's about falling in love. I've always said that it's not enough to know what is wrong in the world. It's also about falling in love with something different, right? With something. So the eco-philosopher Derek Jensen would often ask, what do you love? Because if you love something or someone, you're going to do everything you can in your power to keep that being or to keep that thing alive. So that's just where my thoughts led me.
It's beautiful, Lily. You've given us a lot to think about, as have all of you. What else? Yeah, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about action and resistance, and I mean, like it's one of the problems with the movie, I think, is that, and I think Alan did a nice job sort of laying out how it sort of skewers like all possibilities up and down, but like the movie just isn't very good at identifying a villain, really. I mean, Isherwell kind of, but I think this may be where we run up against the real limitation of Hollywood as a conduit for doing something, because like we all, the bad guy is clear, like the bad guy is capitalism, and I think the movie can't say that for whatever reason, because it's too much a product of the capitalist system, and it'd be biting the hand that feeds it or whatever. And but I mean, it does seem to me, in terms of like active resistance, you got to know what to resist. And one reason Malm's book, I think, is like powerful and compelling is because he's pretty clear about who the villains are and what it is we need to attack. The forces of fossil capital, and those whose consumptive habits are most extreme. Like identifying them seems to me helpful. And like it sort of gets back to why the comet ultimately sort of fails, is because the comet is sort of a gigantic thing and nothing at the same time. But capitalist, the CEO of Chevron, who was just awarded a multi-million-dollar payout after ravaging Ecuador for the past 30 years. I mean, like there's an identifiable villain, and the movie doesn't seem to me to have the guts to point fingers in that way. And as much as there are things I like about the movie, it is unwilling to do that, I think.
Yeah, Alan.
There we go. Apropos what Jeff was saying, if I'm not mistaken, the name of the production company for the film is Hyper Object Industries. And that term itself is redolent with, essentially throwing up your hands and saying, we can't deal with this. So if that's the attitude of the filmmakers when they went into the film, that's very disappointing.
I just had a quick comment kind of about just the irony that we've been talking about with the film and its subject, and then how the circumstances surrounding the production and everything. And I was watching a few interviews that were done with the cast kind of for PR of the film, and it was very strange to watch that because it seemed like a direct reflection of some of the media scenes from the film itself. So it's like, where's the distinction there of what they're commenting on and then what they're falling right back into? So I just thought that that was something kind of funny and interesting note to make.
What I also thought funny, because I also looked at some of the interviews, and it's in some ways such a good satire of itself. In some ways, like some of their comments, like our president that we recently had seemed more extreme and irresponsible than the satirical president in the film. So it's almost like their film is more subdued than the reality we're living in, which was a bizarre point. But I actually tried to look through Twitter to get a sense of while people were talking about the film. There were so many comments about Jennifer Lawrence's hairstyling in the film, which was really funny to me because it's almost like you're just participating in the exact critique that the film is setting up for you to participate in, where like it's an entire film about, you know, media distraction and the distraction of like capitalist commodities. And it's doing that it's replicating those exact distractions when people are watching it. And I think there's, as you know, an educator, I always liked, I recently just showed my class Sorry to Bother You, which I do think is a really fun lampooning of capitalism and race. I showed that to my students, and it's a fun activity, have them talk through and see these gaps. So I see potentials for a film like this to start a conversation, because where the film ends is when the conversation seemingly begins, because it maybe tells us that there's a problem we're not attentive to. And once you acknowledge that, whether you're already in the know or not, then you have to kind of start thinking about, all right, what are the solutions? Because this film's clearly not offering them. And it's actually just calling attention to the cyclical denial that the media industries just perpetuate.
I would say that building on what Alan mentioned and what others have discussed. So normally one of the films that I hate to watch, that apparently my family likes to watch because it's, I guess, very distracting, is the disaster movie where there's a single hero. You know, and it's almost always male, right? So a comet is coming, and now that one man is going to save everyone, right? It's such a common formula in American movies. And so I think it would be much more interesting nowadays to see a movie where you actually had a complex social problem, and then you watched a million different individuals working through networks and in isolated situations, struggling to find a way to solve this very complex social problem. But I mean, maybe it just wouldn't be as entertaining, and who in Hollywood could accommodate or accomplish that? Andrea, you had a
Yeah, yeah, I'm unmuted. Okay, to Jim's point too, and this is like just half-baked ideas that I've been working on in kind of along the lines of what Jim spoke of, which is the fact that the planet has a non-anthropogenic agenda. The planet has a non-anthropogenic agenda. And thinking about this in terms of a plantation history and some new work on plantation history, that the planet literally remaps spaces, geographical, geological spaces. And I just wanted to remark on the other part of this thought that has been in the back of my brain or at the front of my brain for the last like 6 or 7 years, that I received from Dylan Miner, a Métis scholar at MSU, who made this point, this really, I think, really important point a long time ago, that colonial infrastructure is inherently unstable. And as somebody whose ceiling tiles fell out of her roof of her office this past week, there has never been a totalizing power to it. We know history bears out over and over and over again the instability of these geographies, of these racial geographies, of this capitalist infrastructure, of this neoliberalism, this global, these are not totalizing powers. These are not monolithic powers. And I think, to me, those two things kind of go hand in hand, this idea that the planet has a non-anthropogenic agenda. And the fact that these, it's sort of, we can sort of, to me, well, I never want to like erase like injustices, and I never want to like look away from them, and I want accountability and I want change. For me, this sort of idea that if the planet is, able to unsettle, has always been able to unsettle, right? We can take that, I don't know, I always just sort of take a page from the planet in that way. Like I find those connections kind of bearing out in really interesting ways in my own work. So I think kind of we have to kind of, think about both, that the planet is always going to be like, its processes are always going to be bigger than us, and it's not interested in humans, but we are also capable of holding people accountable. We are capable of addressing the fact that these are unstable politics, unstable processes, unstable racial geographies. And it is a responsibility to address those. Like I said, half-baked idea, and probably I sound a little crazy, but there you have it. I had my ceiling fall in on me, so.
Andrea, you make me think of David Pello's discussion about the agency of non-human animals and actual geographical features. I don't know why you always make me think of that every time I see you these days.
Maybe to piggyback on.
Take that as a compliment.
Piggyback on Andrea's and Jim's comments earlier. I don't know that saying that the planet doesn't have an anthropogenic agenda means that, it's indifferent. It's indifferent to the intentions or the actions of beings. Babe, you like talking about the scaling laws. Maybe you should say something about that. But just to finish my thought in that regard, talk about half-baked ideas. There's often I've often heard a thing said about humans being a scourge on the planet, that if we were to be taken out, maybe all of life is going to thrive. And then I was listening one time to a webinar, I forget where the indigenous speakers were coming from, but they said that we can become a keystone species. And maybe Scott knows more about keystone species, where our loss can really be felt can affect the entire ecosystem. And this indigenous woman was saying, if we can take care of a watershed of a particular place in such a way that if we were to disappear, then if the particular group of humans living and taking care of this piece of land so well were to disappear, then the ecosystem may not be maintained or something like that. And so I'm wondering, how can we become that kind of species where we will actually be missed by the rest of creation if we were to disappear from the planet instead of being the scourge. And so I think the planet is not indifferent to us. She actually wants us to be part of keeping life alive. They've just quickly on the scaling laws.
Yeah, so Marcia Bjornerud's Reading the Rocks, geologist working up in Wisconsin, talks about I can't remember the name of the project that has been trying to analyze this, but the basic claim is that for the last 500 million years, roughly, ecosystems have been relatively stable on a local scale and answering to scaling laws, trophic laws of what kind of creatures eat other kind of creatures, the bigger bodied creatures being the smallest in number, eating smaller bodied creatures that are larger in number, all the way down to bacteria, who are the real adjudicators of what's going on the planet in many ways. And she talks about that species have come and gone in all ecologies, replaced each other, gone extinct, mutated new forms into existence. But the overall scaling laws and structure of most flourishing ecosystems has remained roughly stable until human beings got going with monocrop agriculture and city-state systems about 5,000 years ago. And that we seem to be trying to leverage ourselves as not any longer beholden to those scaling laws, populating way beyond what would work for our body size. And I listened deeply to that in trying to ask, what really does the planet want? It wants biodiversity. How does that biodiversity work? How has it worked? What's its track record over the big scales of time? And part of what I end up teaching is that our choice to go to monocropping agriculture, not small scale agriculture, but monocropping, serving city-state systems controlled by elites, is one of the places where we made, I think, a serious wrong turn that now is being called in question by the entire planet.
I think Andrea has her hand up. Did you want to make a comment or a?
Sorry, I forgot to take it down.
Oh,
No, but maybe you could say something about your remark here, the importance of releasing the Wendigo from the theater of colonialism as a lesson or story.
Oh, well, I just, this was to Jeff's point that, you know, there's the rich conversation among, you know, activists and creators and creatives in Indigenous communities, right? The discussion around the role of the Wendigo. And so, I mean, Jeff's point is that, you know, Leduc calls what we are currently experiencing the Wendigo infrastructure, because the Wendigo is this creature of, you know, a lesson, a story, you know, circulated among Indigenous communities to teach their children about the wrongs and pain associated with greed. And so, but Danis Goulet has this great film about how the Wendigo is an urgent story that needs to kind of, in the film, it's a kind of a horror film, and the Wendigo is trapped in an old theater during the apocalypse. And so a warrior woman, oh, her name is Wisaki Kutch, it's so hard to say, Wisaki Chuck. She's a warrior who is in that storytelling history. She is always sort of battling the Wendigo. So there's an apocalypse, there's a theater, and she goes in to find the Wendigo, and the Wendigo is in the theater, and there are people trapped in the theater, and the Wendigo is feeding off of these human beings. And but the film's point is to kind of say that Wisaki Chuck needs to free the Wendigo from that apocalypse, and so that the Wendigo can go out into the world and teach that lesson again. Like, the Wendigo's lesson is both necessary to us right now, but also the fact that the Wendigo, right, that the lessons of the Wendigo have gone unheard for so long in capitalism and colonialism, that we are where we are right now. So it's sort of a statement about the importance of sort of renewing the urgency of those lessons that the Wendigo offers. Yeah, it's Awakening. It's called Awakening.
I was gonna just briefly add something. When we're talking about Don't Look Up, I just keep thinking that what the film does is offer this sort of comforting shared apathy, where those in the know who choose to watch it, who care at all about climate crisis, will go, I'm frustrated about climate denial too, or I'm frustrated that there's this distraction from these issues. And I think there's this level of which, if you're watching it and you are a liberally minded person, you're thinking, yeah, I really wish people would look up. But hearing some of these conversations about the need for really loving something and using the time we have wisely, I started thinking more about the docuseries Planet Earth, which isn't perfect, but they do have a structure in which it's about, look at the beauty of the ecosystems that exist in these ways. This is in danger, but there's easy solutions. Here's the ocean. Here's the problems with the ocean right now. Let's think about the fishing industry. And it always has that sort of like love, beauty of nature, crisis in nature, possible solution with nature. And I don't know if that's the perfect model, but it's something I think would be more productive if Hollywood wanted to approach offering solutions, is to inspire that sort of love rather than that sort of solidarity and apathy that I think Don't Look Up really thrives in.
Excellent comments. I have to say that before I had any conversations here about this movie, I thought it was brilliant the way the movie forced or didn't force, but attracted a lot of people to watch this spectacle in hopes that perhaps it would encourage them to be more active. But I agree with you, and I also agree with Alan that it's kind of demobilized us in a way. It's so taken with with lampooning its own structure that it can't even conceive of anything outside of it, of any sort of resistance or even establishing any kind of strategy. I think these are really amazing insights that you've brought here. We still have some time. Well, actually, we only have 3 minutes left, but who wants to bring us to a conclusion? No pressure. Jeff started us, so maybe Jeff should finish us.
As my friend and colleague Rob Anderson would say, well, fierce rushing together. That's what we need. So like, let's mobilize, and I don't know, what are we going to do? We're going to blow up a pipeline, or I don't know. Thank you for a great conversation. This is really terrific. I learned a lot too.
Couple more minutes to anybody else?
Thank you, Laura, for excellent facilitation. And thank you everyone for coming.
And if anyone here isn't on our mailing list and wants to get on it, certainly contact Lily or anyone else in here. And thank you so much to everyone. What a great conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Great
everybody.
panelists. Thank you.